Hello and welcome to Daily Dose Radio, a 5-minute-a-day podcast studying the Psalms verse by verse, recorded here in the dining room of the Bible Bistro, located in Sharonville, Ohio. Hey there, friend. Welcome back to Daily Dose Radio here in the Bible Bistro. Well, it's a rainy old day outside here at the Bible Bistro, but that makes it a perfect day to come inside and sit down with me for a little 5-minute Bible study. All this week, we're going to be doing Psalm 74, the second half. Now, last week, we ended with probably what is the pivotal verse here in this psalm. It's the fulcrum, in a sense, of this psalm, because everything depends on it. The statements that come before and the statements that come after really depend on verse 12. But God is my King of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. We're going to see how that works because now we're going to begin to compare the first and the second half of the psalm and find that 12th verse is central to the psalmist's entire argument. If you'll recall, this psalm is a ground level view of the righteous judgment of God. He begins the first half of the psalm with several questions. He says, "O God, why have you cast us off forever?" There in verse 1. And then in verse 10, he comes back to his questions and he says, "How long shall the enemy blaspheme your name forever? And why did you withdraw your hand?" So he has several questions there. And, then he comes to verse 12 and he says, "But even though I have all these questions, even though I've seen the devastation is recorded there in 3 through 9, he tells us about this ground level devastation. I said last week that this is like the reporter in the parking lot. They're standing there with the scene behind them, and they're telling you what they're seeing. This is the psalmist telling you what he's seeing as God destroys Jerusalem. So of course he has a lot of questions. It's natural, but then he comes to himself and he says, "But God is my King of old." So it doesn't matter what happens. It doesn't matter. The destruction doesn't matter because God is in control. He is the King of old. And he's working salvation in the midst of the earth, even if I don't see it. I know that God is working salvation in the midst of the earth. Now today we're going to begin in Psalm 74 part 2 with 13 through 15. Let me read those verses for us. "You did divide the sea by thy strength. You break the head of the dragons in the waters. You break the head of the leviathan in pieces and gave him to be meat to the people inhabiting the wilderness. You did cleave the fountain and the flood. Thou driedst up mighty rivers." Now, so he's recalling all that God has done. And you'll notice that each one of those verses begins with the second person singular, you, thou. You did divide. You did break. You did cleave. So he's recalling all that God has done. Well, not all of it, but some significant things that God has done, which feeds into that idea, God is the King of old. Why do we say that? Well, look at what he says. You did divide the sea by your strength. What does that remind you of? It reminds you of Egypt and Pharaoh and his men who were in the sea. The heads of the dragons in the waters. The leviathan in pieces. So he completely destroys Pharaoh and all of his men in the sea. So, we can go back and look at Psalm 66, verse 6. That's going to tell us a little bit more about God's destruction. And then, of course, we can go back to Exodus and look at the story there. You broke the head of Leviathan. You gave him to be meat for the people inhabiting the wilderness. You did cleave the fountain and the flood and dried up mighty rivers. You cleaved the fountain and the flood, the rock in the wilderness. Exodus chapter 17, the people were thirsty. The Lord tells Moses, strike the rock. He did. The rock flowed with water. Water came out of the rock, and it provided for the people in the wilderness. And then, of course, he dried up mighty rivers. What does that remind us of? Well, that's the river of Jordan being dried up so that the people could pass over into the land. God did all of that for the people. He provided for them in the wilderness. He took care of the enemies. He gave them water out of a rock. He dried up the Jordan so that they could pass over. All done. Why? Because God is king in the earth. All right, so join me again tomorrow, and we'll take that up and continue this thought there in 16 and 17 here on Daily Dose Radio. Thanks for listening to Daily Dose Radio. For more fresh and delicious Bible studies, podcasts, books, and more, check out the Bible Bistro online and on YouTube. Join me again next time for Daily Dose Radio.